Sorry. Great. Okay, sure. All right, so Matt Brooks is going to go downstairs to join us. All right, continue. Matt, you were just telling us about Docacon. Sorry to interrupt you.
Sure, no problem at all. Yeah, it was, just to recap, it was great to see all the various applications of interviews and programs that are using Docassemble, both internally within organizations and more public-facing services. And it was also neat to see some of the maturity of things like Community Lawyer and Documate, these other platforms that can make interview creation a little bit easier for people who maybe don't want to dive right into coding in Python.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, it made me even more eager to start doing development work on that. And we're still working on finding the time to do that at Aleo, and seeking funding and stuff like that. But yeah, it was good. It was also nice to see that there is broader interest in developing some data standards and other tools that the greater legal aid community could use going forward. So that's something we're very interested in doing, and hopefully we can be a part of that. And yeah, it was great. I really was delighted to be there. Quentin, did you already share your impressions of the conference?
Oh, no. I think we pretty much all joined at the same time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I would echo what you said. I thought it was nice to see so many different people using Docassemble in different contexts. I definitely learned a lot from the sessions myself. The only thing I was disappointed about, well, I think there could have been more legal aid attendance, but it was great to see people from the Legal Services Corporation there, both Jane and David, who I think were really interested. They came up and spoke to me about wanting to do fund more Docassemble projects in the future, which is good news for your TIG, Matt, and the ones that I put letters of support in for too. So that's really exciting. And I wish there were a better gender balance, because that's disappointing. I think our Boston community is pretty diverse in that respect, but the attendance at Docacon was not. So it's something I hope will be better the next Docacon. A little bit more diverse attendance.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And yeah, it was encouraging to see LSC there and express their interest in using Docassemble going forward too. So thanks for bringing those up. I echo your thoughts.
So if anyone is interested in seeing on Docacon.com, you could watch you could see all of the slides. I believe you could see recordings of most of the sessions too. I think that the session about the showcase was a good way to see a bunch of kind of more diverse types of work people are doing with Docassemble, a little smaller, digestible kind of session, show and tell. I thought Everett had a really nice session about practical things about getting your work out there, and I'm definitely going to try to take some notes on ways to get people to come to the eviction defense tool that I worked on, and think about ways to make that more discoverable, better optimization. And thinking about how to, among the things that he said, one of them was having a content funnel and thinking about ways to have content that gets people to be able to discover your actual tool. So things like blog posts and videos can be really engaging. And another thing that he said was pretty interesting was having things like reviews. So those are things that are easy to overlook, but I think important, that I'm going to try to incorporate. My session was kind of organized a little bit like what we normally do here in our working group, with some just like very practical tips and tricks and overall goals for design of a good interview. I thought it was very interesting to hear from Robert Hudak. He's one of the firms that is using Docassemble, and they've used it to create a tool that they can sell for $50,000 every time they run it, which is pretty great. And he has some pretty good insights about that. I think it'd be interesting to see, like, they seem really interested in helping contribute to the long-term sustainability of Docassemble and improvements to things like security, and both in terms of practical security, but also in terms of checking boxes to make sure you meet requirements that different kinds of clients might have. And then, let's see, Daisy Debs was pretty interesting session, especially during the showcase. Toby's session talked a lot about kind of the theory. I thought it would go a little bit more into like practical elements of how we can use representation of law, which it didn't quite do, but it was like a pretty deep dive into the history and theory. Kind of already went over Everett's. And then Michael Hassan from Community Lawyer had a really good session talking about collaboration and kind of next steps for how we can improve collaboration and lead to a better Docassemble community. I think it's great. We have a few more people who joined, I think, now. Does anyone else have any questions about Docacon or thoughts, something they want to discuss related to that? Not hearing anything, so I'm guessing the answer might be no. Anybody have any questions that they wanted to talk about this week? I'll give you a minute if you were on mute, I guess, to ask those. I'm pretty sure that Caroline had some, but I don't think she's joined us just yet.
Quentin, I had a general question about the way, basically just setting up your development environment. Mm-hmm. Do you find it easiest to do some kind of syncing with either Google Drive or OneDrive, so you can just work on your templates and things there and push them automatically or more easily without having to do more clicks and things, and when you're doing updating and testing?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. And I really want to try OneDrive. I found it's not quite as mature. I think part of it is the OneDrive API isn't as mature, so they change things and they don't document them. So I recommend Google Drive. But that's really helpful for having a good workflow. So like, let's see. Once you've turned on Google Drive syncing, then there you get this button, sync and run. And so your workflow can still be very iterative, where you can make changes locally in something like VS Code. Mm-hmm. And as soon as you make the change and you've saved, what I've done is I put the backup and sync icon so it's pinned to my taskbar so I can always see it. So let's make a little change here. Just put a space in there. So I save it. You can see here how it's refreshing. So I know to wait until it's finished syncing. Then I can click sync and run to show you what it looks like. Nothing really relevant has changed here, although it's going to restart the server because that Python file has changed, I think. So it does all of that in the background. You don't have to be actively waiting and then clicking the next button, which is really helpful.
Oh, so you're doing this syncing both with your code as well as templates?
Yeah, I do use the syncing for code more often than for templates, because for templates, I don't, but it depends on how big the template that I'm working on is. But the editor for Python files is just so much better externally than the one that's built in. For interview files, it's not as big of a gap. But you get things like, as I went over at Docacon, you get things like IntelliSense. This doesn't, in this environment, I haven't installed all the Docassemble Python modules locally, so you can't see those, but it will let you, like, so I've defined a module, a function here called recent years. So once I start typing, it pops up. I can read what I've put here as the definition of the function. It explains how to use it. That's a really helpful hint when you're using it later in the list. Right here, I can see it. It's like right above me, so it doesn't really matter. But like, say I was working in a whole different file even, or just lower down here, you know, instead of having to jump back and forth between the definition and where I'm planning to use it, it's really helpful to be able to have that little info pop up in context. And there just aren't as many helpful things like that for an interview. I think the main thing for editing interviews separately is the split view. So in VS Code, it's actually, I was looking at a menu, but it's really just this button here. So I can see the same file, two different parts of the same file at once, and being able to edit in both places is a really helpful thing.
Right. So, yeah, I was, after seeing the session, or a few of the sessions at the conference, I installed VS Code right away. So I needed to just set up my environment so it can do all the syncing. But that's nice. You know, are the instructions for setting those up posted somewhere?
Yeah. So I'll go to the first step is to put in to get a Google API key for Google Drive. So we can find that in the instructions. Most of those kinds of settings are going to be under the configuration section of documentation.
Okay.
And this is one of those. So let's see, Google Drive. I'll just search for Google Drive.
That's right. Okay.
And then you go to the installation page here to see how to get that key. So all you really need to do is just copy this block here into the OAuth section of your configuration.
Okay.
And getting the Google API key is a little bit more complicated. You do it through the Google Developers Console. You enable the API key, then you create credentials. So there are a few more steps for this, but it's a one-time thing for whoever administers your server. And once they've set it up, you don't have to change anything in the configuration. You go to your profile as a user, just go to your profile and you configure the Google Drive there.
Okay.
And you just have to grant approval. I've already done that, so it's not prompting me for that again, and you can choose the folder you want it to go in. So relatively straightforward once you've done the backend API setup.
Okay, nice, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other questions? Like I said, I'm pretty sure that, oh, Caroline, I think you had some questions, right? You had said.
I just left Mass Law Reform staff meeting. I'm just joining right now.
Okay.
So,
I don't want to put you on the spot.
no, that's okay, because for 3 weeks I've been trying to figure out the list of objects. Collecting a list of objects type of thing, and you've helped Jacqueline and me a couple of times, but we've never really quite gotten through all the way, and I managed to get through it this weekend, which was huge.
That's great.
And I think it's on GitHub under the Mass Legal Help one. So I think it's a good example for people, because in the documentation, when Jonathan's talking about lists, he skips certain steps. So because there's so many different levels, and the difficulty about using a child list that we have is because a child list is already defined, right? It's using the class, the individual, and person, and all that. So there's stuff that is not really obvious. And so what we were trying to do is collect. You have your list of children. Each child has a case, and the child has attributes, and the case has attributes. And so some of the stuff that we figured out is that you have to put information into different code blocks. If you put everything in the same code block, I don't know if people are interested in it, if it's useful, but you could look at it. I think it's on the Mass Legal Help, GitHub Mass Legal Help, and then it's called Collecting Children's Cases.
Do you want me to share your screen, Caroline?
I can do that.
Okay.
Let's see. Oh, no. Wait, oh my gosh, wait a minute. I've lost my tool. Oh, here it is. Wait a minute. It's just down here. Share.
And I'm not sure when you joined, but before you joined, we were just talking about kind of a little report back from Docacon.
Oh, did you finish that?
We did, yeah. It was just a high-level overview, and I was pointing out, you can see the slides and videos for most of the sessions are online now.
Okay, great. I was hoping that, because I joined. I saw that income.py just at the top, and then you switched to talking about setting up Google Drive and using VS Code. So I totally missed that, and I was counting on the fact that you've recorded it. So I just sort of think if we see, and again, sometimes maybe it's worth talking about stuff even if people aren't ready for it yet, because then you remember that you talked about it at one point. So if we go here to groups and the documentation, he talks about what a list is, and then he also has an example in the playground. But there's this that's a dictionary. Gathering a list of objects. Okay. So you've got so here's an example of gathering a list of objects. The thing is that address is already, I don't know what the right jargon for it is, but address is already a thing in Docassemble. So that's why it's good when he talks about fruit, because fruit isn't an already defined DA object or DA list or anything. So when you start from scratch, it's a lot. This isn't quite scratch. And so it got to be a little bit confusing because these already have, this one was a little bit confusing. And then I definitely I thought I understood the concept of gather versus are there any, there is another, and then complete attribute. So I got those really quite mixed up, and I got it to work for a dictionary. So here's this. So this is, I think I might have used this as an example, because this friend, except you have this generic object. So this is skipped 2 levels. So I'll show you what we ended up doing, and then we ended up using some of the loop logic. So it will be GitHub, right? .com, maybe. Mass Legal Help. I think this is where I did it. Yeah, collecting children's cases. And this is not, this doesn't have a document assembly piece. It just has a question that feeds back. This tells you, I tried this probably half a dozen times. So I just kept numbering them differently.
Okay.
So we know child list already exists, but we wanted to do the complete attribute because what I wanted to do was ask for a child and ask for get all the information about the child before I go on to the next child. And I think in general, you talked about this before in one of your trainings, is that you know how many children you have, or if you're talking about children, generally you know how many children there are, but you don't always know how many cases each child has had.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, so we were able to do this children and then the cases, because the cases need to be somehow connected with the children. I assume that you can move this ask number. I don't know how you make a decision here. I assume you can put this ask number equals true into the parentheses as well. Is
Yes.
there some sort of guidance on whether you stick it as part of the, I don't know if you call this the definition of objects, or if you put it into its own code block?
So I would call this, that's a great terminology question. So I would call this the object initialization block.
The code.
This objects block here.
Oh, the objects block, right.
Lines
Okay.
6 through 8. I would call that the initialization block. And for what you should use where, what I would say is that if you already know when you're creating the interview what it's going to be set to, it's not a variable, put it up in the objects block.
Okay, so it makes sense to move this into the objects block.
Yep. I mean,
Yeah,
I guess
'cause
for
you are
readability, it's,
Sorry?
I guess for readability, if you have like 10 things you're going to put there in the definition,
Oh, I see, yeah.
then maybe it's easier to read them like each on their own line. So that's one other.
Right. And it would make sense that you follow the same rule. For what, if you're going to do, either put them up here or put them here, but to put them in two places is not cool. Doesn't make a lot of sense.
I don't think so. I mean, you could think of a situation where whether you're going to ask the number up front is a question that you would ask, and then it might be something like, "Do you know how many children you have?"
Right. Then it would be in the code. Then it would be down here.
Exactly.
Right. I mean,
it would be in a question instead of a code block. But yeah.
Okay. So then, and this is where I was really struggling with this whole, what happens, which of these things requires something. So we know that if you do ask number, you're going to have a target, a variable that's target number somewhere, right?
Yes.
That's what the power behind ask number is. It's just not by itself.
Right.
And if you have target number, then you may not need to do complete attribute. You may not need to do complete equals true because you already know what the number is. So once you've finished asking the questions, you have it. Complete attribute just helps you with the order of the questions, I think, or you only need it if you're asking more than one. If you have more than one question block for the item in the list, then you need complete equals true so that you go through them.
Yeah, and the way I think about it, like when you want to use the complete attribute, and this might be a review, but just to say it one more time is...
I think it's definitely, yeah.
Yeah, only if it's on a separate question.
Right.
So here, like you're gathering the cases, that's separate from the child's name. Yeah. So definitely you want to use the complete block.
Now the thing is, would you need the complete block for children here if you didn't, say you asked about all the children and then you went back and you said, okay, you've told me about your 3 children, Prima, Secunda, and Tertia. So now tell me, has Prima been in any cases? Tell me about the cases. Would you need complete attribute there because you're just going right through that same index again?
You mean for the cases?
Yeah.
Each case, if you gather all the facts about a case on one screen, you don't need a complete attribute for case J.
Yeah, but what about children?
I think you do because it.
So you already have your target number, right?
It won't finish asking about everything about that child before it moves on to the next child, which is probably what you want. But maybe you don't.
What I'm saying is, say you already asked about all children, and then you decided to go back and say, tell me about all the cases for this child. Because you already have defined the number, I don't see why you would do that. I think that would not be a good flow.
Okay.
But all I'm talking about is from the code aspect, you probably wouldn't need complete equals true because you already know what the target number is. So once you've asked about all the cases for the third child, you're done.
Right.
You'd have to finish the cases, but you wouldn't have to finish the child because you'd know that child was done, wouldn't you?
Yeah. So I think if you use complete attribute, well, some kinds of objects you're collecting, you really need to use it because it will just ask you, is there another person? Is there another person? Is there another person? Without asking any facts about the child. So you need at least one attribute to be defined for complete attribute. But in general, like, it can just be harder to predict. So if you like to control the order of the questions, which I think is good for usability and having a better logical flow, it's a good habit to use it. Just so you have control over when the question's asked. Instead of waiting
I
for
agree. I was just sort of saying is that it wouldn't break.
It wouldn't break. Nope. The only thing that happens if you don't use complete attribute is it will ask the questions in an order that you might not expect.
Exactly. So this is what I thought I understood it. And then when I went back to actually try and do it from scratch, I got things muddled. So, and I didn't understand the difference. I'm still not quite sure on the auto gather true and false, but I didn't have to do that. So, what I do understand now is that so that you're required to ask the number of children, and then in the next block you say, okay, ask the first name because you want the cases. You want to know all the cases of the child before you go to the next child. Then this children cases gather forces Docassemble to ask the questions about the cases. And there is only one question about the cases, but this sort of puts you into the cases questions mode. And then you finish it, and then you come to, when you finish asking the questions, you're like, okay, I'm done with this child. I go on to my next child. And then what we found is that we had to separate the children I cases J had to go into a different code block from the children I. And because it kept saying to me, I isn't defined or J isn't defined. I was like, what do you mean it's not defined? I've told you. But as soon as we moved it into a different code block, then that worked.
So that's like a good thing. It took me a little while to kind of get the hang of what should be its own code block and what shouldn't.
Yeah.
Something that I've been thinking about is a good analogy for anybody who's used hot docs to develop is if you would make it its own computation in hot docs, you should put in its own code block. Simple. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but
maybe just have to think about it for a bit. So. And what's cool is that this is what I realized is that gather. So you don't. When you look at these three code blocks, you don't know. You to figure out. Well, how do I know I'm gonna run this? Because this, it's the order. I want the question that has a parent role as the last field in the cases question. But you could do your cases questions here if you had more than one. And then you say you're complete. But what runs this is the gather. If you didn't have the gather, you wouldn't run this code.
Yeah, like eventually it would when you tried to refer to something in the case. But this lets you control when it happens.
Yeah, well, I in the question, it didn't seem.
It never asked it because you're not displaying.
The question that forced it, and it didn't seem to want to do it. It was the gather that made it ask that stuff.
Yeah, I'm looking here, like we're in line 33, and it looks like that for loop should be triggering displaying the case.
Yeah, it told me case wasn't defined.
Let's go up a little bit to your objects definition block.
my object.
Or, well, I was calling it initialization block before. So I should.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, children I.cases. Yeah, so that should do it, really. And you have a question like for there are any, and there is another?
Yeah, they're here. So I started with, because I was using Jonathan's model where he puts, the question is what, he does this a lot, it seems, so that sometimes you may not have to put the order of your questions in the code, because the required question forces the code to answer the questions, not necessarily in the order you want, but because like you say, it's asking for it, so it has to it forces you to ask the question somewhere before it can finish its own spit back of the question. So we ended up using this loop thing. I think we used it a couple times, so that was very cool. So because I got stuck, I put J in here at first, and so it would only give me the last case, and then I realized that J gets assigned a different, because we're saying for case and children I cases, not J, so you're not incrementing J here. So that worked really cool. I'm not quite, I think I have to go back to, I think this is the Mako formatting, because what I ended up with was I did get 2 bullets here, but then this indented set of bullets is in a gray box. So I'm not too worried about it, because this was just to test to see if we actually got what we wanted.
I think for your second level of indent, you need 4 spaces instead of 2.
The second level, this one.
Because it's 34 and 35. Those are supposed to be 2 different levels of indent, right?
34 and 35, yeah. So Are you saying on the outside of the asterisk it needs to be indented more?
Yep.
So cut where the cursor is now.
Yeah. Put in, I'm not sure actually how many spaces that is right now, if that's 1 or 2. Below.
I think it's 2.
Yeah, it should be 4, I believe.
Okay. So right now it's bulleted, but it's in this gray block.
So you could find that answer to that, like under if you looked up Markdown formatting.
Markdown, okay.
Yeah.
All right. By the time I got it working, I was like, I don't care what it looks like.
Yeah. Understandable. Great.
So then we do our target number and ask about, this is just abbreviated, just so I could get through, so I could test. And there's our cases, there are any. It's forced to be asked by the gather, cases gather. And here's our question about cases. And I suppose just for an exercise, we could make each one of these be a separate case. Separate question block. And then the gather would force it. We'd use the code and the gather would force them all to be asked. And then you'd get your complete attribute equals true once parent role was answered. And then here's our, there is another thing. Oh, and this was the loop last. This was the way we fed back to the user how many cases we'd asked about this child. So we say this child, we know we're talking about the child, but how do you tell somebody the cases that they've already told you about? So I picked docket number because I thought that's the only thing that's going to be unique to each case, is the docket number.
Yeah.
So I didn't get to the point where I put in the attorneys or docket numbers. When you were showing Jacqueline and me how to do the list of a drop down of attorneys, which you would ask here, who was so you might have another question, different question. Was your child represented by an attorney? Yes or no? Who was the attorney? And then child attorney or whatever it was, would be in your code block up above. But I just thought that for me, if there had been an example like this in the documentation, I would have really been grateful.
Well, you can put it up as a recipe now. Send it to Jonathan.
Yeah. So how do you put it up as a recipe?
Well, I mean, you could edit it, and I think it's easier probably to send it to Jonathan and say, hey, I think this would be a helpful example.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the only reason this isn't a good example is because we're using child list, which is already defined. So if you were going to do this, if this were truly going to be helpful from scratch, a list of objects, it's actually a list of objects that has attributes, and one of the attributes is another list of objects, right? Could you say that? The cases are another list of their objects.
Yeah, there's a list of objects underneath. Yeah.
Right. So, and why would you, when I was going through all this, one of the examples had object type equals, instead of DA object, it said it has equals thing. Is that, why would you do that? Is thing a defined DA object already?
That's an interesting question. Do you know where that is? Where the example is?
Let's see.
It might have just been a random. Yeah, I know it's hard. I guess you could look for thing.
Yeah. Equals.
Try it. I'm not sure.
I think it was. I could just do thing. It's either here. Oh, that's 2.
2 generic, 68 results. Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
4.
there's too many of them.
Okay, well that
it was either on this page or when you're in
hold on,
playground.
Karen. I'm wondering if this was it. Like, if you go back up one, there was an example where it was iterating and then it called the temporary thing. Go back one more, maybe.
It was definitely in the code. And it said object type equals net. It's not, this isn't it, because this is your whatever in here. It said DA object equals thing. And I could probably find it. But, and it, as I said, I was going back and forth between this and the playground where,
there's some examples there too. Okay.
Yeah, in the playground where you have the examples. But
I don't know. It's not I'm guessing if it is a class, it was just one made for purposes of a demonstration.
Yeah. So I guess that's the thing is, going forward, how helpful it would be. And maybe it's already here and I'm still not comfortable, used to the documentation enough, is to have, it's so easy to build something like a child list and then find out, oh, it exists already.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bad thing. So actually, one of the things I talked about in my slides, which thanks for everyone who gave comments, a few people who were here did, was about when you should create your own class. And I think once you've done it, it'll be demystified. So in your example, you're not creating your own class, you're just using DA objects, which works really well because there's nothing really fancy you need to do with the case. But let's say you did. Say you wanted to be able to spit out a case caption for the case, or
because case is already
just summarizing the details of it, on one line in your table. You might want to create a function which does that, and then you'd really want to create your own class, and it would be a really simple class that inherited from DA object, and it would just add on that one method that would let you spit out the summary of the case. And then you might find something else you wanted to do with it that was similar. Sometimes it just helps you know what your thing is. Instead of calling it a DA object, it's a case object.
So if you called it a case object, you would have to create a class.
You would. But your class, all it might do would just be to name itself, just to let you separate what are the things and what are the variables in my interview that are cases, what are the variables that are whatever other types of objects that kind of represent a real world thing that are in the world.
All right.
So I think that might be a good session. I've been kind of going back and forth. It's a little bit more detailed of a topic than everyone would have been ready for at the beginning of our sessions.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
I don't think it's actually as bad as it seems. So if people are interested, I guess you could kind of either chime in or you could leave it in the chat. Let me know if you would want to have a
Well,
session.
I think that, we started to, I think it's great to have the workshops, but we also started to talk about using your income, your income module to, for example, develop a TFTC eligibility thing. And I think that would be a good exercise because that's a real world example of when, why, and how you would define classes and do some of the other stuff. But maybe that's more than what you're proposing.
No, that seems like a good fit. So yeah, let me know. And it looks like we just lost Lena, who would probably be really interested in that. But if you are interested, you can either like I said, chime in or leave a message in the chat. And
are we talking chat? Are we talking Slack? Or are we talking about chat on Zoom?
Oh, either one.
Okay. All right.
Or you could just let me know later if you think it would be interesting, I guess.
I put it in Slack on the GBLS channel. Does everybody, like the mats that are here, are they able to get to the GBLS Slack channel or both of them? Okay.
Yeah, I can get to it.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about Natanya? Do I know Natanya? Hi, Natanya.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just barely.
But
Yeah, I'm just making a note right now to find GBLS on Slack.
Okay. Where are you from, Natanya?
I work with Matt at Aleo.
Oh, cool. Okay. Great. All right. So I'll put it on the GBLS Slack. I just posted as a message on GBLS Slack.
sure.
Okay. I'll do that. Okay. Because I think Jonathan's got some documentation on that, but all of a sudden you read Python and you start seeing this stuff and you're like, what? And the other part of that, I think, is that whole thing about generic, using X and the generic object.
Yeah, that's a bigger topic, but I think we could definitely get into that.
Okay.
I think it's also
that in the, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Phases.
Yeah.
I definitely like a tutorial sort of starting at the beginning of this, if you could move.
Talking about how classes work, Mariah?
Yeah. If you could do maybe a little intro overview and then move into it, that would be great.
Okay. So, yeah.
Also, Natanya, Quentin's done a bunch of these. A lot of these are recorded on the YouTube channel as well, right? You know that?
Oh, yeah, I do know that.
Yeah, I think we talked about groups,
them yet.
which introduced the idea of a class, and then it was just like a minute or two of our session. We didn't really go into like how do you define a class, so I could design something around that.
Yeah, I think that'd be really helpful.
I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe closer to the end of the summer. I'll have some time to like design a couple of slides for that. And actually, I guess let me just preview one more thing. So one thing I could do is, so let me just go back to sharing here. So I realized I talked I said that what happened at Docacon, but
is that different from the AI thing that you went to?
Yeah, it was.
Oh my God, I'm just so behind in the times.
No, it's okay. It was a lot of conferences in 1 week. Well, there actually were a lot of other conferences besides.
Yeah.
I was only at 2. So this is what I talked about. Some of these are things we
Mhm.
talked about in our working group already. Like how about controlling the flow of an interview, some things about coding style, separating your interview files and how many to use, the right editor to use, and object-oriented principles. So I can have a session where we talk about those slides in a little bit more depth too, because I know most of the people who are here were not at Docacon. I think the only person who's on this, who was there, is Matt Newstead. So if people are interested in that, we can talk about this too.
Yeah, I think we can talk about object-oriented principles over and over again.
Yep, there's a lot to it. But I think it's just a different way of thinking. Some people are now kind of pushing back on object-orientatedness. Best way to say that? Orientation. There are other programming philosophies that have taken over and become a little bit more popular in some areas, but I think it's a really helpful way to think about programming, especially for somebody who's coming at it as a non-developer. You have to wrap your head around it a little bit, but once you do, it lets you kind of neatly organize the concepts that you're using in a kind of a natural way. Like objects kind of map onto the real world in a way that this other paradigm called functional programming, which is more popular, is more mapping onto math than real world things. So I think it's a helpful way for us to think about it as non-professional programmers. Okay, so we have about 10 more minutes. I won't go into those slides now, but I'll think about, sounds like there is enough interest in doing something about object-oriented programming, and probably it will be like a couple sessions. One would be just basic concepts. The next would be, maybe we could move into, after that, we could move into the example with the TAFDC calculation and the real world example.
Okay, I think that would be cool to do that. Evolution.
And I could reserve some time. I guess it could have been in this session too. If we didn't have any questions, I would have jumped into this presentation, but maybe the next time that we're able to meet, I can set aside the beginning to do that for people who weren't able to come to Docacon. And about 10 minutes left. We're not going to be meeting on next week, the 3rd, but we could meet on the 10th. People are available, so I'll send out a reminder for that, probably the beginning of that week. And 17th, I won't be around, but we could meet again the next week, probably for a couple of weeks in a row. It seems like these have been working pretty well. People are having questions to ask. I'm happy to share my answers. Definitely easier than creating a session that's just more lecture format. So keep those coming. But if someone feels like they want to share something, this is definitely an opportunity to do that.
I'm really looking forward to using that. I mean, hopefully I'll figure it out before then, but the whole TFDC eligibility thing and using because it's such a powerful module you've developed, that income module, to help people figure out how to use it in their, you've got so many different techniques in that and different ways to customize it, to use it for different contexts.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep going into that. All right. Well, before we wind down, Caroline, I don't know if we answered your questions.
Yeah, I think I had a lot of questions, and then I think I've managed to get a lot of them answered. By when I was succeeded in that interview. But do you think you could just talk again about what auto gather is and what the difference between true and false is, and what when you right where so what are we doing with auto gather, and why? So for example, in my example, I didn't put auto gather in anywhere. I know by default auto gather is one or the other, but you actually, I ought to put dot gather in a code block. So what is all that? How does that all work together? What does that mean?
Yeah, let me see if I might be able to pull this up from my slides. So let me just take a look.
I mean, that's as long as nobody else has any questions. But.
No, where did I put it? Okay. I don't think I'm sharing anymore, but. So just like as a little refresher, so what we're talking about is the different ways of gathering items in a list.
Oh yeah.
So, yeah, so when you use auto gather, you're telling Docassemble to ask the questions on its own that it needs to know when the list is finished. And that it's not really on its own because you still have to set up a question that it can ask. So that would be there is another, there are any, and there is another.
So if you
That's
just use there are any and there is another, then why? What's the deal with auto gather? I mean, you have to use there are any and there is another.
Yes. So when you wouldn't use auto gather would be when you are defining the whole list in code. So maybe you're getting it from an API result or like a database query or something like that, or you're just predefining the whole list in a code block, which you might do for different reasons. To do like, there could be a number of reasons why you want to use a Docassemble list, but you don't want to have any questions that fill in the list. Like you already know what's going to go in the list up front. One is because like if you like to use object checkboxes, for example, those only work with Docassemble lists. They don't work with regular Python lists. So you have to tell Docassemble that you're not going to be collecting that list through questions. Otherwise, it'll say, hey, why haven't you defined there are any and there is another? You don't care about those questions because you already know exactly how many things are in the list up front.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why you would turn that off. It's for like using a Docassemble DA list, but not using any questions to fill out the items in the list.
So maybe it would be good to have a couple of examples of those.
Yeah, let me see if I can pull up one from GitHub.
Like when you would, if we have an example where auto gather is true.
Well, you never define it true because that's the default. You never have to define it true.
So do you put it in, or you just don't even mention it?
You don't even have to mention it.
Okay, so you only put it in if it's false.
Yep.
I mean, if you want it, what I mean is, if you want it to be false, that's the only time you only say auto gather equals false. You never say auto gather equals.
If I can find it this way.
Now that would be a cool thing.
No, well, it wouldn't be capital F, not lowercase.
Would you have spaces in between the? No.
So I think it's only searching for the repository name. Yeah, it's not working. Okay. I'm trying to remember where I would have done it. I use it pretty often. Like I said, it's when I'm gathering a list manually. And then if you do use the auto gather equals false, then there's a separate variable you need to use, which is called gathered.
Oh yes, exactly. Which is kind of like complete attribute, except different. It just it lets it know when you finished gathering.
Yeah, that's what is right here, exactly. It lets you know when it's finished gathering, exactly right. Oh, I think I do know where. So what place I do it. So it's going to be something like you might do in a module, for example. So I think here, this module, which gathers items from a SharePoint library, I think I might use that here. There we go. So I'm gathering it to a DA list. This is a list of all the files in a SharePoint folder. I define it to be a DA list. I'm turning off auto gathering. It's actually something I'm calling a lazy file list, but it's an extension of a DA list. And then I actually retrieve all the items from SharePoint. That's these lines of code here, 136 through 142. And then when I'm done, I set gathered equals to true. So like you can imagine like, you might do that with questions in a different kind of interview, like what's the next file's name? What's this file's name? But when you're doing it in code, that's just the technique to still let you use a DA list and use some of the kind of nice shortcuts a DA list has, including better
Would an
compatibility.
example be if you had a list of I don't know, say you had a list of defendants and then you wanted to make a list of defendants that were under 18 or something. Could you do something like that, like auto gather only certain characteristics of the defendants in the under 18 list? Would that be something is that the kind of thing? So you've already defined your list of defendants, and then you say, I'm going to have these defendants under 17, but I don't want to know their addresses or something. Or I don't want to know their social security numbers or their addresses, but I still need their names and their ages. Would that be the kind of thing that you might do the auto gather false equals? So you're just pulling certain character, you have an existing list?
Well, the thing that's making me think of is like if you're copying a list, like say like some subset of the list you want to do something with.
Right. Yeah.
Then you're using code to create a new list. So then you might use auto gather equals false because you still want a DA list, like I said, with all the different special things a DA list has compared to a regular Python list. And you don't care about, you're not going to be gathering it through questions, you're doing it through code. So
right.
Yeah,
right.
Copying a list is another circumstance that might come up more often than using like.
What was the last thing you said?
Yeah, so copying a list, that's another case where you might do that.
So auto gather.
Yep.
Right.
It may not come up that often. I think you'll probably know when you need it. You're like, I don't want to have to say there are any equals true and then there is another equals false when I've counted the right number. You just want to let it do it naturally when you're using code to build your list. That's basically the circumstance where you want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I think maybe we should stop there for the day. And I think Caroline, we're going to stay on for another meeting, right?
Yeah, are we going to use this Zoom or are we doing another Zoom? I don't remember what we're doing.
I told Will we could just use this one just to keep it simple.
Oh, okay. And does that one doesn't start till, that meeting doesn't start till 3:15, right?
That's right.
Or does it, okay.
3:15. Right. So we could call back in if you wanted to. Be fine.
Okay. I might just go get a drink. That's all. Been inviting us all.
Yep.
Thank you, Quentin.
All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you in a couple weeks.
All right,
Thanks,
bye-bye.
everyone. Take care.
Bye.